The sound of canvas ripping is the last thing you hear before the shockwave hits your chest. It is a deafening mechanical roar that vibrates through the steel bulkheads, rattles the fillings in your teeth, and forces your body to instinctively crouch, even if you are standing 3 decks below the waterline. This is not the sound of an incoming explosion. It is the sound of the ship fighting back. It is the signature acoustic violence of the Mark 15 Phalanx close-in weapons system, a 20mm radar-guided Gatling gun mounted on the sponsons of an American nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. In a fraction of a second, the 6 spinning barrels spit out 75 armor-piercing rounds made of solid tungsten. The radar dome above the barrels, the distinctive white dome that earns the system the nickname R2-D2, is no longer taking commands from a human operator in the Combat Direction Center. The system has switched to autonomous mode. Its Ku-band radar has detected an inbound supersonic anti-ship cruise missile skimming just 10 feet above the cresting ocean waves, traveling at twice the speed of sound. A human being cannot react fast enough to calculate the intercept geometry. The computer has taken control. It tracks the incoming missile, fires a burst of heavy metal, and simultaneously tracks its own bullets in flight, instantly calculating the error and walking the stream of tungsten directly into the path of the threat. The goal is not just to hit the missile. The goal is to create a hyperdense wall of kinetic energy that detonates the enemy warhead a mere 2 seconds before it can punch a hole through the carrier's armored hull. When you watch the news or see recruitment commercials, the aircraft carrier is always portrayed as a floating airport. The cameras focus exclusively on the graceful, lethal lines of the F-35 Sea Lightning II, or the roaring afterburners of the F/A-18 Super Hornet launching from the steam catapults. This relentless focus on the air wing creates a dangerous public misconception: the belief that the carrier itself is just a massive, defenseless barge, a floating parking lot whose only weapons are the jets parked on its roof. But this is a fatal misunderstanding of naval architecture. An American supercarrier, whether it is the legacy Nimitz class or the cutting-edge Gerald R. Ford class, is a bristling, heavily armed apex predator. It possesses one of the most sophisticated, multi-layered, and autonomous air defense networks on the planet. And deep within its steel belly lies an arsenal of high explosives so massive it could level a small nation. In this deep dive documentary, we are going to look past the airplanes and dissect the anatomical lethality of the ship itself. We will peel back the layers of armor and electronic warfare to expose the carrier's inner, middle, and outer defensive shields. We will explain the brutal physics of the RIM 116 rolling airframe missile, a weapon that literally spins its way to the target to save the weight of steering components. We will venture into the invisible, silent war fought by the SLQ-32 electronic warfare suite and the Nulka hovering rockets, digital ghosts designed to seduce enemy missiles into attacking empty ocean. We will descend 7 decks below the waterline, past the armored citadel, into the ship's magazines, where the air smells of ozone and gun oil, to understand why a Navy bomb is chemically and physically different from an Air Force bomb, and how a rough, bumpy coating of paint prevents the ship from destroying itself in a fire. And we will walk the flight deck with the red shirts, the aviation ordnancemen who move 1,000-pound explosives by hand across a wet, pitching steel deck in the dark. This is the unvarnished story of how the world's largest warship defends itself when the fighters fail, and the enemy slips through the net. The defense of an aircraft carrier operates on the doctrine of concentric rings, a layered shield of violence that gets increasingly denser the closer a threat gets to the hull. The outermost ring of the ship's organic point defense, ignoring the escorting destroyers and the fighter jets, is handled by the Evolved Sea Sparrow Missile, or ESSM. Mounted in massive box-like Mark 29 launchers positioned on the corners of the ship, the ESSM is the heavy hitter of the carrier's self-defense arsenal. When an incoming threat is detected by the carrier's dual-band radar or the legacy SPS-48 air search radar, the ESSM is deployed to kill the threat at ranges exceeding 30 miles. But the ESSM is not a standard straight-flying rocket. It is a highly agile Mach 4 interceptor equipped with thrust-vectoring tail controls. When the missile launches, vanes inside the rocket exhaust manipulate the thrust, allowing the missile to perform violently tight, high-G turns immediately after clearing the launcher. This allows the ESSM to intercept sea-skimming cruise missiles that are performing evasive corkscrew maneuvers or high-altitude ballistic threats diving at extreme angles. The newer Block 2 variants of the ESSM feature an active radar seeker in the nose. This means the carrier does not have to continuously paint the target with its own targeting radars, tying up the ship's sensors. The carrier simply tells the ESSM where the target is, fires the missile, and the missile turns on its own radar to finish the hunt autonomously. This fire-and-forget capability allows a single carrier to launch dozens of interceptors simultaneously to defeat a massive swarm attack. But no defensive shield is perfect. If an enemy missile utilizes advanced stealth technology, extreme supersonic speed, or heavy electronic jamming to survive the ESSM envelope, it enters the middle ring of defense. The time to impact is now measured in single-digit seconds. This is the domain of the RIM-116 Rolling Airframe Missile, or RAM. The RAM launchers look like rectangular honeycomb boxes, each holding 21 small, incredibly fast missiles. The RAM is an engineering masterpiece built on a simple, brutal physical principle. Traditional guided missiles use 4 steerable fins to maneuver up, down, left, and right. This requires complex internal servos, heavy batteries, and intricate flight control software. The RAM, however, features only 2 steering canards on the front. As the missile is ejected from the launch tube, the rifling in the tube and the missile's aerodynamic shape force the entire body of the weapon to roll rapidly in flight. Because the missile is spinning, those 2 control canards can steer the weapon in any direction simply by actuating at the precise microsecond they are aligned with the required turn. This spinning motion eliminates the need for heavy, complex steering mechanisms, allowing the missile to dedicate more of its internal volume to rocket fuel and high explosives. It makes the RAM incredibly fast, highly reliable, and devastatingly maneuverable. The guidance system of the RAM is equally ingenious. It operates on a dual-mode seeker. When an enemy anti-ship missile approaches, it usually emits a radar pulse to find the carrier. The RAM uses passive radio frequency antennas to detect that specific radar pulse. It literally rides the enemy's own targeting signal back to the source. As the RAM closes the distance to within a mile, it switches to a highly sensitive infrared seeker. This thermal eye locks onto the aerodynamic friction heat generated by the incoming missile's nosecone slicing through the air. Because it uses the enemy's own heat and radar emissions against it, the RAM is almost entirely immune to electronic jamming. It is a brilliant, unforgiving assassin that requires no input from the ship once it leaves the tube. If the threat miraculously survives the RAM, it enters the inner ring, the terminal phase. The threat is now less than a mile away. It is traveling at thousands of feet per second. This is where the Phalanx CIWS, the 20mm Gatling gun, takes over. The Phalanx is the weapon of absolute last resort. It is a closed-loop system, meaning it contains its own search radar, its own track radar, its own targeting computers, and its own ammunition supply in one self-contained unit. If the entire electrical grid of the aircraft carrier is knocked out by battle damage, as long as the Phalanx has cooling water and a dedicated power feed, it will continue to fight independently. The gun fires armor-piercing, discarding sabot rounds. The projectile consists of a lightweight plastic sabot that wraps around a heavy, needle-like penetrator made of depleted uranium or tungsten. When the round leaves the barrel, the plastic sabot strips away, and the sub-caliber heavy metal dart slices through the air with minimal aerodynamic drag. The goal is not explosive fragmentation. The goal is pure kinetic energy. The tungsten dart is designed to punch straight through the hardened nosecone of the incoming anti-ship missile and detonate its warhead in the air, or physically shred the aerodynamic control surfaces of the missile, causing it to tumble harmlessly into the ocean before it can reach the ship's hull. The latest Block 1B variants of the Phalanx are also equipped with forward-looking infrared FLIR cameras, allowing the gun to manually target and obliterate small, fast-moving surface threats, such as explosive-laden suicide boats attempting to ram the carrier in narrow straits. But kinetic weapons, bullets, and missiles are only the visible half of the carrier's defensive arsenal. The most sophisticated battles fought by an aircraft carrier happen entirely in the electromagnetic spectrum, completely invisible to the human eye. This is the realm of the AN/SLQ-32, pronounced Slick 32, the primary electronic warfare suite of the ship. The Slick 32 consists of massive, geometrically complex antenna enclosures mounted high on the ship's superstructure. These antennas are constantly listening, scanning the entire radio frequency spectrum for the specific radar signatures of enemy ships, aircraft, and inbound missiles. When the system detects a threat, it can respond with devastating electronic attack. It can blast the incoming missile's radar seeker with massive amounts of targeted radio frequency noise, effectively blinding the weapon and causing it to lose its lock on the carrier. However, modern anti-ship missiles are programmed to counter this by aiming directly at the source of the jamming. To defeat this home-on-jam capability, the carrier utilizes one of the most bizarre and brilliant defensive weapons ever invented: the Mach 36 SRBOC, Super Rapid Bloom Offboard Countermeasures, and the Nulka decoy. When a missile is inbound, mortar tubes on the sides of the ship fire a barrage of chaff, clouds of thousands of microscopic aluminum-coated fiberglass filaments. These filaments bloom in the air, creating a massive radar reflection that looks to the enemy missile like a giant steel wall, hiding the carrier behind a cloud of metal snow. But the Nulka is far more advanced. The Nulka is a hovering rocket. When fired from the carrier, it does not fly away. It deploys a thrust-vectoring rocket motor that allows it to hover in midair, slowly drifting away from the ship. As it hovers, it activates an internal electronic repeater. It receives the radar pulse from the incoming enemy missile, amplifies it, modifies the signal, and sends it back. To the enemy missile's computer, the hovering, 3-foot-tall Nulka rocket looks like a 100,000-ton aircraft carrier. The Nulka literally seduces the enemy missile away from the ship, drawing the lethal warhead out over the empty ocean where it detonates harmlessly. It is a digital ghost, a masterpiece of electronic deception. While the defensive systems protect the ship, the true purpose of the aircraft carrier is offensive power projection. And that power requires a massive, terrifying amount of high explosives. To find the offensive arsenal of the ship, you must descend deep below the waterline, far beneath the flight deck, past the hangar bay, and through heavy armored hatches into the weapons magazines. This is a subterranean world governed by strict, unforgiving rules. The air here is meticulously climate-controlled to prevent the degradation of chemical propellants. The floors are coated in anti-static materials, and sailors must ground themselves to prevent a stray spark of static electricity from causing a catastrophic chain reaction. The danger of hazards of electromagnetic radiation to ordnance, is paramount. The ship's own powerful radars and communication antennas generate so much electromagnetic energy that, if unshielded, they could induce electrical currents in the firing mechanisms of the bombs and rockets, detonating them inside the ship. When you look at the bombs stored in these magazines, you immediately notice a profound physical difference between naval ordnance and the bombs used by the Air Force. An Air Force bomb is typically painted a smooth olive drab green. A Navy bomb, such as a 1,000-pound Mark 83 or a 2,000-pound Mark 84, is painted a dull, rough, textured gray. The surface looks and feels like heavily applied stucco or coarse sandpaper. This is a thermally ablative coating, and its existence was paid for in blood. In 1967, on the deck of the USS Forrestal, a stray electrical surge fired a Zuni rocket across the flight deck, striking a parked aircraft and rupturing its fuel tank. The resulting pool of burning jet fuel engulfed several loaded bombs. At the time, the Navy used standard, smooth-cased bombs filled with an explosive compound called Composition B within 90 seconds of being exposed to the fire. The heat caused the explosives inside the smooth bombs to cook off, resulting in massive, high-order detonations that ripped holes in the armored flight deck, killed 134 sailors, and nearly sank the ship. To ensure that a catastrophe of that magnitude never happened again, naval engineers fundamentally redesigned their ordnance. They replaced the volatile Composition B with a new, highly stable, insensitive explosive compound called PBXN-109. You can shoot a bullet into PBXN-109, and it will not detonate. It requires a specific, massive shockwave from a primary detonator to explode. More importantly, they covered the steel casing of every bomb with the rough thermal ablative coating. This coating acts exactly like the heat shield on a spacecraft entering the atmosphere. If a modern Navy bomb is engulfed in a pool of burning jet fuel, the ablative coating begins to char, bubble, and outgas. This chemical reaction absorbs the intense heat, creating an insulating layer of carbon that protects the steel casing. This rough, bumpy paint gives the ship's firefighting crews roughly 3 to 5 minutes of precious time to extinguish the flames or push the bomb overboard before the internal explosives reach their critical cook-off temperature. When you touch the rough surface of a Navy bomb, you are touching a life-saving engineering modification born from one of the darkest days in naval history. Moving these massive munitions from the deep magazines to the flight deck is an industrial ballet of heavy machinery and manual labor. On the legacy Nimitz-class carriers, this is accomplished using heavily armored wire-rope weapons elevators. These elevators are slow, requiring massive hydraulic winches to pull the ordnance up through the decks. On the new Gerald R. Ford class, the Navy replaced the cables with advanced weapons elevators that use magnetic linear synchronous motors. These elevators travel in blast-proof shafts at twice the speed of the legacy systems, allowing the ship to move 24,000 pounds of bombs from the keel to the flight deck in minutes, drastically increasing the speed at which fighters can be armed and launched. But once the elevator reaches the flight deck, automation ends and human muscle takes over. This is the domain of the red shirts, the aviation ordnancemen, known throughout the fleet as ordies. These sailors belong to a proud, insular subculture whose unofficial motto is "Iyayas." If you ain't ordnance, you ain't shit. Their job is brutally physical, chronically exhausting, and inherently lethal. When a massive 2,000-pound JDAM, Joint Direct Attack Munition, arrives on the flight deck, It is not loaded onto the jet by a robot. The red shirts must manually transfer the bomb onto a low-slung wheeled cart called a skid. They must then physically push this skid across the non-skid surface of the flight deck. Imagine pushing a cart weighing over a ton across heavy grit sandpaper in the dark, while the deck is pitching and rolling in a heavy sea state. They must navigate a chaotic maze of moving aircraft, spinning propellers, and deafening jet exhaust that can blow a man overboard. Once they reach the aircraft, they use a manual hand-crank mechanical hoist to lift the bomb perfectly into position under the wing pylon, carefully aligning the sway braces and plugging in the electronic arming umbilicals. They do this inches away from a jet engine that is idling at hundreds of degrees, breathing in the toxic fumes of burnt aviation fuel. They execute this heavy industrial labor with terrifying speed and precision, ensuring that when the pilot pulls the trigger 300 miles away, the weapon functions flawlessly. The weapons of an aircraft carrier are not just the missiles in its launchers or the bombs in its magazines. The weapon is the entire integrated system. It is the radar that sees the threat, the computer that calculates the intercept, the automated gun that fires the tungsten, and the exhausted, grease-covered 19-year-old sailor who manually loads a laser-guided bomb onto a strike fighter at 3 in the morning in the middle of a typhoon. An aircraft carrier is not a defenseless runway. It is a highly armored, electronically invisible, heavily armed fortress that possesses the kinetic ability to obliterate anything that enters its threat ring. It is the ultimate expression of industrial military power, designed to survive the most hostile environment on Earth and project devastating force onto the enemy. If this unvarnished, deep dive into the mechanical realities and ballistic physics of an aircraft carrier's arsenal changed how you view these floating behemoths, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, subscribe to the Tactical Chow channel. We refuse to read you sanitized press releases. We dissect the engineering failures, the physics, and the hard truths of military hardware. Second, smash that like button. It is the kinetic interceptor that helps our content slide past the YouTube algorithm and reach a wider audience of engineering enthusiasts. Third, leave a comment below. I want to know, which defensive system do you think is the most critical to the carrier's survival? The autonomous wall of tungsten from the Phalanx CIWS or the electronic deception of the hovering Nulka decoy? Let the debate begin in the comments. And finally, if you think the defensive systems of a surface ship are intense, wait until you see the catastrophic offensive firepower of an Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine. Click the video on your screen right now to witness the terrifying engineering required to launch a nuclear-armed Trident missile from deep beneath the ocean's surface. It makes the weapons of a carrier look like a conventional skirmish. Click it, and I'll see you there.